Okay, I'm going to wait for 3 o'clock on the clock. All right, it is 3 p.m. UK time, so I'm going to kickstart the meeting. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, depending on where you are in the world. Good morning, Greg, and possibly good evening, other people. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon's webinar. So my name is Palesa Mulibadzi. I'm one of the 2 new research fellows here at the Institute of Education, and I'm very happy to have been asked to chair this session. I'm going to try and keep the introduction quite brief because an hour is really short. The presentation today is based on a working paper which has come out of the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate project, or Climate Uni. That's the shorthand title of the project. Those of you who are familiar with the project will be familiar with that shorthand title. So to give a very quick overview, the project is funded by the GCRF, the Global Challenges Research Fund. And in the main, it really just looks at the role that higher education can play in responding to the climate crisis, not only through the research role that the university plays, but also through teaching, community engagement, and more general public awareness. The aims of this project, among other things, include strengthening the contribution that universities can make to addressing both the causes as well as the impacts of climate change in lower income contexts. So in so doing, this particular project also contributes broadly to the task of trying to understand the role that education plays in achieving the whole set of sustainable development goals. To say one final thing, there are 16 universities involved across 8 countries and 6 continents. So it's quite a huge project. And yeah, also a fascinating project. So with that, I will go straight into introducing our 2 panelists. So we have our speaker and we have our discussant. Our speaker is Professor Tristan McCowan, and he is Professor of International Education at the Institute of Education here at University College London. His work focuses on higher education and international development, particularly in Latin America, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa. And his work also then focuses on issues of access, of quality, innovation, as well as sustainability. His latest book is Higher Education for and Beyond the Sustainable Development Goals. Over the period 2015 to 2021, he's also been the editor of Compare, which is a journal of international and comparative education. Professor McCowan is also the lead on our Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate project. So that said, our discussant then is Greg Mishiaz. Forgot the pronunciation, Greg. You can correct me later. He's an assistant professor at Beijing's Normal University at the Faculty of Education. And he holds various positions, including associate director at the Paulo Freire Institute, is that correct? UCLA. He's also an executive editor of the Teaching in Higher Education Critical Perspectives Journal. He was part of the book series of Bloomsbury's Freire in Focus, and he edited that. He's co-editor of the Journal of Global Comparative Education. And Greg's work focuses on the critical analysis of environmental pedagogies with specific emphasis on eco-pedagogy through theories of globalizations, citizenships, race, gender, migration, indigenous issues, among a whole host of other issues. His recently published book is Eco-Pedagogy, Critical Environmental Teaching for Planetary Justice and Global Sustainable Development. So I'm going to leave it there. Before I hand over and actually start the webinar, I will say that, of course, we'll have a question and answer session at the end, but do pop your questions into our Q&A, I don't know what to call it, Q&A bit in the Zoom thing. So not the chat bit, but the Q&A bit.
And I'll be looking at the chat and the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions or any kind of troubleshooting or anything, just you can ping me.
Yeah, you can ping both Lorena and myself. We will be quite responsive, I think. All right, Tristan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Palesa, and also to Lorena for her coordination, and Greg for being respondent. It's fantastic to be here. And to talk about teaching climate change today. And the teaching of climate change is just one of the many aspects of the universities that Climate U, the broader project, looks at. And in fact, a lot of the project is actually around community engagement, research, and so forth. But today we'll be focusing on the educational dimension of climate change. And also important to highlight right from the start that teaching climate change is really just one aspect of a broader discussion around the learning process. And in a previous working paper and webinar, we talked about that broader learning environment and self-directed learning and peer learning, which are absolutely crucial. So the discussions today, which are really around formal education and climate change in the classroom, as it were, are just part of that picture. The other thing to say at the start is that this is a theoretical paper today and discussion, but of course it makes sense in the real lived experiences of teaching and learning, in which and a lot of the Climate U project is very practical. And our Kenyan colleagues, for example, are grappling with these questions in the different universities there. I know a lot of you in this webinar today work with these issues on a day-to-day basis, and really looking forward to hearing some of your responses in the discussion afterwards, and also the links with schools. We have colleagues who are looking at the teaching of climate change in the school environment, and it'd be interesting to look at the connections there as well. When we think of tipping points in relation to climate change, we usually are thinking about very worrying negative tipping points of the different environmental factors setting in motion a chain of events which are irreversible in terms of environmental destruction. But as Malcolm Gladwell's well-known work on the tipping point shows, we can also think of positive tipping points as well. And it's one of these that I want to look at today, the idea that the incorporation of climate change in the curriculum and in our teaching and learning processes might set in motion a change of positive regeneration and revitalization in education. One that can actually help us to achieve some of the more demanding aims that we set ourselves as educators. And I'll share now a cartoon which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. It's a well-known one, showing a skeptical delegate at one of the climate summits complaining, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And making an important point, as highlighted by many commentators on this, that the kinds of things that we need to do to address the climate emergency are things that we would probably want to do anyway, and are part of a healthy social and natural environmental situation. And so what I want to do today is to apply some of these ideas to education, and to argue that the incorporation of climate change in our teaching and learning processes, while a very challenging thing, and I don't want to belittle those challenges, are part of a deeper transformation that we would want more broadly. to contextualize a little bit, why is learning important in climate change? I mean, you could argue that maybe learning is a bit of a periphery aspect of what's going on here. So first important thing is to show why is learning so crucial. And the first of those points is that we are dealing here with an anthropogenic crisis. And because the roots of the climate crisis are in human societies and in individual humans, we also need to think about solutions based in those societies, a civilization crisis. It's also one in which solutions are needed at all the different levels, structural, but also in terms of our lives and beliefs and so forth, which also brings learning dimension in strongly. We need to think about mitigation, adaptation, and regeneration in terms of preventing, lessening greenhouse gas emissions, but also adapting to changes underway and creating new social and environmental relationships to revitalize and create a new world. Two other reasons why learning about climate change is particularly important. One is that it's a highly contested issue, and I'll say a little bit more shortly around denial, climate denial, but of course, even without going to the extreme lengths of denial, there's a lot of discussion and debate around how exactly to address this. And lastly, its complexity. There aren't simple technical fixes to a straightforward linear problem, and as such, reflections. The literature that we have to date on climate change education, it'd be interesting to hear from some of our those present today who've been involved in this research and practice, has shown some things clearly. First, that knowledge, or at the very least inert knowledge, isn't sufficient to bring behavior change. Also, the need to think about the political as well as the technical issues. The fact that it incorporates an action dimension and the importance of experiential learning, and also engaging emotions. So much of this research has taken place at school level, but there's also an increasing amount of research in higher education that looks at some experiences of teaching and learning climate change and points to some of these findings, but also documenting some of the outcomes. It's still a literature that is developing, but we have an increasing number of studies that are pointing to some of these points that highlight the importance of engaging emotions using arts and other forms of learning. These are, of course, highly challenging in the university context for the following reasons. Firstly, the curriculum is already very crowded, and particularly in courses that require on professional accreditation, it's very hard to fit new things in. Those people who are teaching in universities are usually specialists in a specific disciplinary area. They may not feel themselves equipped to be teaching climate change if they're not environmental scientists. They may be concerned about what are very contested issues, may bring people into arguments in the classroom, and that have an obvious value base. And there's a broad discussion around whether universities should be involved in the promotion or even dealing with value contested questions, or indeed whether they could ever shape people's values at all, given that we're dealing for the most part with adults. Other challenges involved are relate to some of the questions that we looked at on the previous slide around the need for experiential learning and incorporating into different disciplines. So all of these make for a highly challenging scenario, and in practice, climate change is not as yet, with a few exceptions, dealt with across the board in terms of teaching at undergraduate, postgraduate level. What I'd like to look at now is to how, despite these obstacles, we can think of the incorporation of climate into these diverse courses as a driver of positive change. And I will just highlight at this point that I'm going through all of these points very briefly so that we have as much time as possible for discussion. But if people want to look in greater detail, we can share the full written version of this that includes some of the things. So I want to look at this in terms of three areas of human practice: the ontological, epistemological, and axiological, which is quite a common way of dividing up philosophical or sometimes methodological concerns in research. The ontological relating to being, epistemological to knowledge, and the axiological to values. And not because these are the sum total of all questions that we might be concerned with. There are some others, the aesthetic, for example, but they do cover some of the weightiest questions which we're engaging with. What I want to argue here is that these are not questions that are or should be confined to philosophy. These are fundamental questions that all human beings can and in fact must engage with in their lives, and should be the foundations of all teaching at all levels, from early years through to adult education. So how do these manifest in relation to climate change? What I'll argue for each of these three is that the incorporation of climate forces us to deepen our consideration of ontological, epistemological, and axiological issues in our teaching. And I'll just give some examples, not exhaustive, and I'm sure you can think of many others, but I will just give some examples of how teaching and learning around climate change can deepen our reflections on these different aspects. So the ontological first. First, naturally, the climate system. So the world that we live in, the ways in which the different elements of the system, the earth, waters, ice, sun, atmosphere, and so forth, interact to create the climate system. And the human being, in terms of our individual and collective cells and cultures that have brought about the civilization that has led to a paradigm of exploitation and accumulation. And in relation to both of these, the key element here being interdependence. Climate change forces us to reflect on the interdependence between different elements in the planetary system, and between different human beings, and between humans and the non-human environments in new ways. So a point that's very commonly raised in relation to this, but one that can deepen all people's reflection on ontological questions. The second is the epistemological. Now, it's well known that there are many people who deny climate change altogether. It is a small minority of people, but there's a much broader group of people who have skepticism or engaged in what's been termed climate delay, of a superficial acceptance of climate change, but with a putting off either in terms of corporations or individuals. And while it might be tempting to exclude questions of climate denial and all contestations around climate change from our teaching and learning processes, they are in fact opportunities for epistemic awareness in terms of understanding what the scientific basis is, what the room for doubt and differences of opinion are in that, and as they relate to the different value contestations, which we will deal with shortly in relation to the axiological. Climate change also forces us to think about divisions between disciplines and how we might work in a multi and also an inter and transdisciplinary fashion. And finally, to what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls an ecology of knowledges. So the need to incorporate within our curricular educational processes different knowledge traditions, indigenous knowledge, cultures from different parts of the world, languages, diverse languages, in dialogue as a way of bringing these different resources to bear, seeing their intrinsic worth, but also in order to solve the climate conundrum. And the final set of questions is the axiological. Climate change also forces us to think about values, our own values, the values we hold collectively, and the different values between cultures, particularly because of the intense injustices associated with climate change in terms of the causes through historical and ongoing greenhouse gas emissions being focused in wealthier communities and countries, and the disproportionate impacts on the poorest communities and countries. But it also forces us to think about questions of freedom and authority. At what point does it become justifiable, if ever, in the context of climate crisis, for authoritarian measures to be imposed? There's a number of fictional accounts which are helpful in navigating these very complex issues. And finally, climate change also raises questions of the good life. What kind of life is valuable for a human? Is it just a question of solving the climate crisis so we can carry on a very high resource-intensive lifestyle, or in fact, is a more frugal one actually a better life? These are all, again, complex questions that can be explored in relation to. And the final point is that all of these questions need to be looked at in the context of the fundamental pedagogical principles of critical questioning and deliberation. And these are foundations of pedagogical traditions throughout the world, but ones that are always in threat. They're always under threat from transmission approaches and more mechanical approaches to teaching and learning, which undermine both the critical reflection of learners, the agency of learners, and the collective discussions. These are critical questioning and deliberation are complementary characteristics and can take many different forms. And we may have time and space and in the discussion to think of some of the specific approaches in Socratic questioning, Freirean problematization, many other approaches to critical questioning in education, and forms of deliberation and discussion in classrooms which exist in many traditions around the world. So these are the two elements that we should bring, but there's a virtuous cycle that is created. Normatively, we need to bring these to our teaching of climate change. It's not advocacy in the classroom, this is an educational process. And both in order to respect learner agency, but also in order to solve the climate crisis, we need autonomous, critical individuals and collectives. But there's also a virtuous cycle created here where dealing with these issues will also enhance critical questioning and deliberation. So those are the reflections that I will bring to you, which I hope will provoke some responses from the participants that we have here. Climate change should be dealt with across all aspects of the curriculum in universities. That's a point that's widely accepted. And it should also deal not just with the knowledge content, but also political dimensions, experiential values and emotional aspects. Those are points that are also accepted more broadly nowadays. But we can see this not only as a burden, but also as an opportunity to revitalize and to deepen our educational processes, our challenges to our worldviews, to put in dialogue different knowledge traditions. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your reactions.
Thank you so much, Tristan. That was short and sweet. Wonderful. I'm already seeing a couple of hands up in the chat. Please hold off until Greg has responded. So before I hand over to Greg, the one thing I forgot to mention is that, as Tristan said, this afternoon's presentation is based on working paper 8, which is available on the Climate Uni website. And I've popped that into our chat. So if you'd like to go and have a look at that working paper, please do. The link is in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, please keep writing down your questions or sticking them in the chat. Both Lorena and I are on top of that. And Greg, over to you then.
Great. Well, thank you, Tristan, for a wonderful presentation. I can't believe that you made it so short, because I was able to read the paper myself, and I know there's so much richness in there. I wanted to thank you for inviting me, and also Polisma for chairing. I apologize for the pronunciation, and also Lorena. So my overall focus on climate change education is eco-pedagogy, this aspect of critical environmental education coming from the work of Paul Freire. So one of the things that I've been doing is I have a special issue in teaching in higher education, which is higher education teaching for environmentally just sustainability and problematizing those words. And myself and Kaya Rodriguez has written a short article on 6 questions to ask higher education, and it very much fit into this presentation and the working paper. So I'm going to structure my discussion through these 6 questions. Basically, the 6 questions was, how do we prioritize or value sustainability? And the second question is development. What are the politics of unsustainability? Third is, what is the responsibilities of higher education? Or that's the 4th question. 5th is this aspect of Southern theory. What epistemology do we prioritize or not prioritize? And the 6th one is this aspect of how do we have education a lot of times that's anthropocentric? So going through these different questions, it was wonderful to hear the presentation. This aspect of tipping points, when we talk about what are the frameworks that we define sustainability, not just through, environmental studies classes, but in a holistic approach to higher education. How do we use it in all the disciplines? And how can we have this aspect of tipping point, as Tristan talked about, this aspect of catalyst for change? And how do we make sure that it isn't a tipping point where there's no turning back from it? Also, questioning of sustainability. What are the baselines of sustainability? This is a question I think should be repeatedly asked within higher education. How do we define what are the goals of sustainability? If it's how the current world is, then the same socio-environmental violence will continue. So what is that baseline that we're teaching towards, and how can we problematize that within our teaching in higher education throughout all the disciplines? And this aspect that Tristan really focused upon too is this aspect of how can we teach in such a way that social violence is inseparable to environmental violence, which a lot of times, going towards that 4th question, politically, a lot of times it's this aspect that trying to separate as a miseducation that, environmental violence is separate from social violence and injustices, but they cannot be separated. How can we teach towards that when we're teaching frameworks of sustainability? This aspect of development, this aspect that all of education, a lot of times people argue that it's for development and this aspect of citizenship or being a viable member of society. So whose development are we going towards? Especially when we bring in aspects of globalizations from above and from below, pluralized, and also this aspect of neocoloniality and so on and so on. The frameworks of development, who is development for? Who does it benefit and who does it not benefit? My own work uses this aspect of upper and lowercase development as oppressive, or truly sustainable and local? And how can we use these aspects when we look at development? What are the socio-historical oppressions that has happened because of how we define development and continue to happen? Such as Santos, Boaventura Santos, talks about it within aspects of coloniality, patriarchy, and capitalism, or even worse so, neoliberalism. But also these aspects of, say, racism, heteronormativity, and all these other aspects that why is the world such an unjust place? And how can we change that in these aspects of sustainability? For the third question, this aspect of trying to teach in a way that we try to unpack, have students being able to critically read, or in my own work, eco-pedagogical literacy, this aspect of critically problematizing what are the hidden politics. Michael Apple talks about environmental violence is a continuum. You know, it's not just evil corporations doing evil stuff, but it's also being here talking about environmental education, having the computer on, the lights on. Here in California, I don't have air conditioning or heating, so that's not an environmental concern yet. But it's this aspect of, you know, how can we have people think about every time someone switches on a light switch, where is that energy coming from? What is that aspect of development and de-development, sustainability and planetary sustainability? And that these are difficult questions, but they're systematically formed as difficult questions, because politics, for it to be useful, for those who commit acts of unsustainability, they have to be well hidden. They have to be structurally hidden. It has to have what Henry Giroux and others talk about, a hidden curriculum. And it's trying to unpack those different aspects of why do we see these aspects, like Tristan has said, this aspect of, say, livelihood, that we connect it to unsustainability. Or I know in the working paper, these aspects of, you know, connecting freedom with anti-environmentalism. Well, I should be able to, as you know, coming from my own context as an American, to pollute the environment as much as I can, but trying to figure out not only how does that hurt the environment in, say, the context that you're in, but also globally. You know, how can we have it that it's social justice, socio-environmental justice as a globally holistic, all-inclusive aspect, and that, you know, you can't just, you know, separate. Just because, you know, say the United States is polluting, that doesn't mean that the air isn't going over to Canada or Mexico, no matter how many times a politician will say that it isn't. These other aspects is the fourth one is, what are responsibilities of higher education? The holistic approach. And Tristan in the presentation, and even more so in the paper, talks about what is all the obstacles. But our paper and all of my work is this aspect, is that it is the responsibility, it is the role of higher education and all of education, but higher education within the public sphere towards this aspect of praxis, this aspect of, you know, trying to teach in such a way that students are able to critically read environmental violence and trying to figure out what are the root causes rather than the superficial ones of environmental violence. The fifth one is this aspect that using Southern theories, such as Raywin Connell, Boaventura de Souza Santos, and many others, this aspect that Tristan has talked about, Boaventura, these ecologies of knowledges. How can we use diverse knowledges? How can we disrupt epistemologies of the North? And Santos talks about them as grounded in coloniality, patriarchy, and capitalism. And that change cannot happen unless we look beyond that. And there's a misunderstanding a lot of times where this aspect that, you know, it isn't epistemologies of the South, it's supposed to overtake all other knowledges and ways of thinking, but it's more the power dynamics and aspects like that, which Santos and other Southern theorists talk about. How can we use different epistemologies to try to figure out what are the absences, what are the epistemological absences to understand environmental issues, And what are the possible emergences? And that goes on to my final aspect that we wrote about, this aspect of how does higher education promote anthropocentrism, this aspect that's centering humans, not devaluing that humans should be centered on the suffering and their injustices, but also this aspect of that it's the rest of Earth. And I don't use the to objectify Earth, that's a whole other eco-linguistic aspect to it. But it's this aspect that in my own terms, I use this aspect of how can we de-distance the world Earth? This aspect that how can we have this aspect of understanding and valuing nature rather than seeing it as separate? And you can use the work of people like Ivan Ilyich and others in the last chapter of Deschooling Society. But it's this aspect that coincides with Southern theory. How can we use diverse epistemologies? So I'll end there. I think I just made 10 minutes, but thank you again.
Thank you so much, Greg. You've made less than 10 minutes. You have 18 seconds left. Well done. Well done.
Oh, that almost never happens.
Yeah, that was phenomenal, actually. And that said, there are a number of hands up, in addition to a couple of questions, both in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'm going to go in order of whom I saw first. And the very first hand up that I saw was Marie. So Marie, I'm going to allow you to speak. If you could please share your comment or question, that would be fantastic. And then I'll move on to Almas and Muriti. Yeah, so in that order. Marie, I think your microphone is unmuted. If you turn off your mute button, you should be able to speak now. Okay. Marie, I'm not sure if you can hear me or if you're still there. Let me know. Perhaps pop us a comment in the chat. For the sake of time, because we've got about 25 minutes left, I will move on to Muriti. Would you like to go ahead and give us your input? Please remember to unmute yourself, because even when Lorena and I have given you permission to speak, you still have to turn on your microphone.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
Be part of this. I'm very glad. It's a nice platform. Okay, I'm Gideon Murithi from Kenya, Kenyatta University. Yeah, my question is, for now we are talking about transforming higher education to ensure that to tackle climate change and environmental justice. But I try to think that it could be more sustainable, and we could have achieved several SDGs, like SDG number 4, which is quality education. The other one is 11, sustainable cities and communities, because if we could incorporate environmental studies or climate education from the lower education system, that is from the lowest level of the education, that is from the lower classes. In Kenya, we start from primary schools. I think that would be very sustainable, and it is cheaper compared to the higher education, which we are in right now. In this case, we will have grown up young people or students who are aware from an early age that it's good to care for environment, unless in this case that you have grown, you have got to upper high school, and now you are in college. That's where you find that there's all this education about environment. You know, in my case, I didn't know about environmental education until I was in Kenyatta University. That is when I knew that there is environmental education. And I believe I could have done more when I could have known about environmental education at a younger age than I knew when I joined the university. In this case, it's also sustainable to have it here in the higher education, but later in the day, I'm gonna urge you to look into smaller, to the low level, because it will encourage people and instill that culture of taking care of the environment at an early age. By that case, we'll have attained zero hunger, because everyone will be conscious about the environment, and it will be a sustainable solution when it comes to tackle on this. I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Muriti. Your question wasn't necessarily directed at either Tristan or Greg, so I'll allow the two of them to decide who responds to the question / comment. That said, in the next round, I think I will take 2 questions because I see 2 hands up. So yeah, go ahead, Greg and Tristan.
I think, yeah, take the next 2 and we'll answer them together.
All right, as long as you've noted that question or comment, then I'm happy with that. All right, Michael Mbaike, I'm going to turn on your microphone and do go ahead and give us your
thoughts. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can.
Wow. It's great fun to be here. Tristan, thank you so much. Greg, wow. You had so much to say that I could wrap my head around. I am not asking a direct question with regards to the entire presentation. I'm just going to be asking questions to ensure that my continuous research is aided and enabled. Tristan already knows why I'm on this call. We've had previous conversations. So my question would be, I hope that I can, of course, get this recording as quickly as possible so that I can relive it again and be able to condense better Gregory's presentation or his probe to the entire paper. And I hope that I can also find a way to copy Tristan and copy Greg if I have any question with regards to especially what Greg had said in his feedback to this presentation. The second thing I'd like to understand better, I can gather right now that from this presentation, from this webinar, I can understand that paper 8 is further interrogated with this presentation. So I want to ask, the previous webinars you have on the YouTube, is it dedicated to specific paper so that I can be sure that when I go to each of those webinars, I will be sitting on each of them vis-a-vis any of the papers? So these are the concerns I just have for now. But however, you guys are doing a great job. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for that question / comment. To respond very quickly, there is a link to the working paper that this particular presentation is based on. There are all sorts of other resources that are available on the Climate Uni website. And I think what I will do is put in the homepage or the landing page of the website so that you have the ability to browse freely through all of the stuff that is available. In the future, we also hope to share a number of other very interesting, stimulating multimedia types of content. So we'll tweet those. If you're following us on Twitter at Climate Uni, then you will have access to that. Okay, so before I let Greg and Tristan answer, there was one more hand up, and that was from Almas. So Almas, you've put your hand down, but I just want to check, do you still want to ask your question? If not, we have another 2 questions in the Q&A segment that I can get into. So Almas, can you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down? Some indication? Or silence, which could also mean you've changed your mind.
There are also 4 4 questions in the Q&A, so we can, and those are written down. So
I'll pick one of those up. So this one was coming, no, so Materi already asked his question. There was one anonymous respondent, Lorena, and they haven't typed their question actually, but
oh yes, under open questions not answered, under open there are 5.
Yeah, I don't see that.
Okay, so I'll read out the first one, and then maybe we can go over the first 3, and then we can do the next 3. So the first question from Mumta is, could a planetary health framing perhaps help to mainstream issues of sustainability across disciplines?
Okay, so if Tristan and Greg, you've got all 3 of your questions and you're ready to respond, then you may go ahead.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'll say a few things and then hand over. Thank you everyone for your different engagements. And Michael, yeah, thanks for good to have you here. And I think Palace has answered the question about webinars, but it's good to have your engagements with these questions. I mean, in terms of the planetary health framing, I think it would be good to hear from the person who asked the question a bit more about how they see that. If the person is available to turn on their microphone, I think that would be good. Needless to say that you can address these issues from a variety of different angles. And whatever background we're from, we usually like to unify from our own perspective. So you can see pretty much all of these things from an educational angle if you're an educationist. If you are a health professional with a very broad conception of health, all of these things can be considered part of that. And that's not necessarily a problem. I think if we understand that deeply, we can see that all of these things are interconnected. And I think we want a really broad conception of education and a broad conception of health, which includes the others, but as long as we can coexist. In terms of Mariti's point, absolutely. You know, this is the fact that we're looking at what higher education can do is not saying that the lower levels of education shouldn't be doing this or that it's instead of it. I mean, I absolutely agree that it is fundamental that at all levels of the education system, these ideas are built in. Early years, primary, secondary schools, all other spheres of society in which learning takes place. That's absolutely crucial. And particularly when we're dealing with values, because as we know, the most influential years for value formation are early ones. I mean, it stands to reason with very small people navigating the world. These are crucial years. The point is that doesn't let universities off the hook. You can't just pass responsibility elsewhere. So I think it's the early years, but it's also about what happens in universities, because it's not that we just, we expect to receive from schools these, the people that already have these things in place. And we know, we may like that, we know it doesn't happen in practice, but even if it did happen, there's still a continuing job that takes place, because otherwise what you have is universities being a mill for churning out people, employable graduates who cease to have any interest in human communities and the natural environment. They're just job-getting machines that then act in the interest of their corporations afterwards. And that's what's brought us to this crisis in the first place. So yes, all levels, but it doesn't let universities off the hook. We also need to embed all these things in.
And I think I entirely agree. The first question, it's this aspect of all levels of education, like Tristan is saying, and also this aspect of all types of education. It's not just formal education or schooling, but also non-formal and informal, social movements, environmental movements, but also public pedagogy, informal education. Especially, I often ask my students, where do you learn more? In classrooms like this, virtually or in a tangible classroom, or outside, talking, media, family, social media, and these aspects of, say, post-truthism and aspects like that especially with climate change, has to be really focused upon too. And one of the key things too, Robert Anoff has a really good article. I can send it to anyone who emails me, that talks about, where does change happen? Where is best to put funding for education? Primary, pre-primary, secondary, adult education, and so on and so on. And there's good reasons for each. And I often ask my students, like, where would you put money? 100%, what percentages? But there's good reasons for each of them. And I think have to focus on all of them, but it's tough with, limited funding and resources and things like that. For the second comment by Michael, thank you. Wonderful. You can always email me or go to ecopedagogy.com and get a lot of my stuff too. And the third question, very quickly, the planetary health form framing. This is very much important. I think very essential. The question is, how do we implement it in a meaningful, deepened and widened way? Meaning deepened this aspect so it's not simplified. It's not a step-by-step method, but it's really critically approach, and also widen that it's not just looking at what's happening locally, but also globally and planetarily, which should be from the framing. But I think the key thing is, how do you implement that, not only as a cookie cutter thing where, well, it works here, so it's going to work over here and here and here, which was a default a lot of time for early and unfortunately continuing comparative education methods. But that's it. It's contextual lending and borrowing of a framing that's very important. We can have the tenets of something like that, but how do you implement that contextually, meaningfully, diversely, democratically, and all these other questions? But thank you for the first three questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tristan and Greg, for your responses. We're running out of time quite quickly. I'm going to take another 3 questions from our Q&A segment. And, well, some of them are comments that end in a question. Sonia says, Tristan, it was such a fantastic speech. Could you please discuss a bit more about the axiological, epistemological, and ontological aspects in higher education from Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy? So that is number 1. The second question from an anonymous attendee is, I strongly agree with this approach about thinking about other epistemologies, for instance, Southern epistemologies. Popular knowledge, traditional knowledge should be motivated. My question is how universities can do that, and how professors, researchers can stimulate in the academy another way to produce science, while also considering traditional knowledge. So that is question number 2. Finally, comment/question 3 is, thank you both for an informative presentation. In your presentation, you have acknowledged that university curricula are already too loaded. In your opinion, how best can environmental education be incorporated in every course or program offered at universities? That's a tough question. Good luck. And over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, some great questions there. And yeah, just so we can possibly get another round in, just some very quick comments. I mean, I think on the Freirean front, I mean, I think there are 2 different but linked things, but they are different. I mean, one is Freire's own, and Greg will probably be able to speak more to this, but Freire has his own ontological position, epistemological position, axiological position that he presents in his texts. But he also has an educational process and method which opens that up. And it doesn't necessarily mean leading people to Freire's own ending point on this. And I think what we need to think about is that wonderfully open but demanding position that Ferry provides of actually giving us a framework for actually unlocking this process which is deeply rooted in a respect for human beings, so not in a sort of fragmented individual way, but in terms of groups as well. On the question in the Q&A about, I think this is a really fundamental one about epistemologies of the South, because it's one thing to say that this is a good idea. It's quite another thing to actually do. Incredibly difficult, a really important question. I mean, we should have a whole webinar on this. But I think one thing is reading lists, but that's just a starting. There are also languages, use of different languages. But then there's also use of the students that we have and the different staff members who can actually draw on their own experience of different knowledge traditions. And then there are more radical solutions, completely different forms of pedagogy, different ways of understanding the teaching learning process. Indeed, if there is even a teacher and a learner at all, some other kind of process, new forms of institution that may not correspond to what we think of as universities. So I think there are some baby steps that we should all take, and then there are some much more radical solutions that we may need to take ultimately and should do. And very quickly on the overcrowded curriculum one, yeah, I mean, we can't turn every course into environmental science course, but climate change manifests itself, even if we're thinking in a purely disciplinary way, in every discipline. There are economic questions that relate to climate change. I mean, you cannot actually teach economics now without looking at this. It would be ignoring a fundamental aspect. Same with politics. So I think we can, even in a disciplinary sense, we can draw out the specific elements relating to this. Over to you, Greg.
Great. Well, thank you. Very great questions. I wish I had better answers, because some of these, especially the last two, this is a crutch of the whole problem. The first one is this aspect of Freire, and there's so much to say about this, but I think one of the key things with Freire is, bringing out this dialectic aspect of education, that diversity of understandings is important, that the teacher and the student is both the student and the teacher. And that also answers the second question, this aspect of how do you bring in, and Tristan was saying, one of the aspects is bringing in students, knowledges, understandings, experiences, cultures, traditions, and so on, languages. And a lot of education, it's this aspect of what Freire called banking education, where, the teacher just tells the student how to think, what to think, and all these aspects, but it's actually using everyone's experiences and knowledges. And that's one of the key aspects of Freire's work. And also this aspect of how can we teach in such a way. Freire uses this aspect of Hegel's master and slave, that the master actually has less power than the slaves, because the master is defined by the slaves. So it's aspect of when people recognize that they are the hosts of their own oppressions, their own environmental oppressions, and also that they're using other people, that's when change happens. And that's kind of my answer to questions 1 and 2. And the second one is, it's very difficult. How do you implement all these different aspects? And I think the way that I would answer it in just 1 or 2 sentences is how not to implement it. One is this aspect that it should be just a step-by-step method, because that almost never works. But we should have groundings of and tenets of what can be, what needs to be taught, but not in such a way that it's not fluid, where it's just a cookie cutter approach. Well, this works over here, so it's going to work everywhere else, and that almost never works. And this aspect of training and radically transforming, universities is one of the key things too. Universities are very much disciplinarily siloed with funding and everything like that. And also, which a lot of times it's challenging the canons, the canons of the higher education, especially when we bring in epistemologies of the South. So that's how I would answer the three questions very briefly, but probably should have been more brief.
Well, that's fine that it wasn't brief. I think your response is quite comprehensive, and I appreciate it, as will many, I think, other attendees. I don't know if we should take a final question. We have a minute left. So if I take a question, only one of you can respond, and then we're done. So the final hand that I saw was from Daisy. And before I turn on your microphone, Daisy, if you would still like to ask your question, I just want to say anybody else who wants to pose their question to the team, please do so either on Twitter or whatever, via email or whatever other form of communication that you have to access us. We're quite open to answering questions after the seminar. So Daisy, I have turned on your microphone if you still want to ask your question. No? Okay. Silence means if we're okay, I'm going to close the seminar here.
There's two great comments from Angeline and Michael in the Q&A. I've copied these,
Okay.
and I've copied these just to send to Tristan and Greg afterwards. Thank you for the really, really engaging questions and points raised there. I think, yeah, it's one of those things we could talk probably for a long time about all of these things, but really appreciate your engagement, and hopefully this is kind of beginning of a longer discussion, but thank you all.
Yeah, and I must say thank you, Lorena, for keeping your eyes on the chat and on the Q&A. There are some really fantastic long comments, which I think I will tweet to our main page and people can respond there. I think that's one of the most interactive ways of continuing the engagement, at least now, while the discussion is fresh in our heads. Otherwise, like I said, feel free to pop an email or whatever else. And yeah, thank you again, Greg and Tristan. I appreciate that you both kept to your allocated times. And before closing, the one thing that I am required to say to everyone is that we have our next seminar on Tuesday, the 8th of November. It will be at 9 a.m. UK time, and that will be quite an interesting one because one of our country partners will be presenting their literature review, specifically Fiji will present their literature review, and it's an interesting opportunity for people who don't know a lot about the Climate Uni project to get a better sense of the different contexts of the various institutions and countries and continents that are involved in the project. Otherwise, I think I'm ready to close the seminar. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you to our speakers and to Lorena and everyone who commented and chatted.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks very much.